On the afternoon of the 19th of July, 1545, a 140-foot warship was leading the English fleet out of Portsmouth Harbor to engage a French invasion force when it heeled sharply in a sudden gust, took water through its open lower gun ports, and rolled onto its side. Inside, 400 men were trapped beneath rigging and netting that had been stretched across the upper decks to prevent enemy boarders. Most could not climb out. Witnesses on shore, including Henry VIII himself, reported hearing the cries of the crew before the ship sank into 13 meters of silt off the Isle of Wight. Of an estimated 400 to 500 sailors, soldiers, archers, gunners, and ship's boys aboard, fewer than 30 are believed to have survived. The ship was the Mary Rose, the King's favorite warship, the second largest vessel in the English Navy, and a centerpiece of Tudor naval pride. Within an hour, she was on the seabed, where she would remain for 437 years. The men who went down with her were, for almost 5 centuries, presumed to be English. Tudor naval doctrine, the iconography of the longbow, and the political weight Henry VIII placed on a navy crewed by his own subjects, all pointed in the same direction. The Mary Rose was an English ship, sailing under an English king, lost in a battle to defend the English coast, and her crew were assumed to be men drawn from English ports, English shires, and English service. The few surviving Tudor records of the men aboard listed mostly first names and shipboard ranks, with little detail about where any of them had been born. There was, in 1545, no apparent reason to ask. The crew of an English warship were, by definition, English. When the ship was rediscovered in the silt of the Solent in 1971 by a small group of amateur divers led by Alexander McKee, the bones of those drowned men began to come up out of the seabed alongside the timbers. By the time the ship herself was raised in October 1982, in the largest underwater archaeological recovery operation ever attempted, the partial remains of 179 separate individuals had been retrieved, along with rope, longbows, leather shoes, wooden bowls, mariners' whistles, dice, and personal possessions that had been preserved in the anaerobic mud beneath the wreck. For the next 4 decades, those remains were studied at the Mary Rose Trust in Portsmouth. Forensic anthropologists reconstructed 92 of the skeletons in full or near full articulation. They estimated ages, body mass, occupation, related stress patterns, and causes of death. The skeletons told a story of a working ship's company. There were teenage boys, men in their 30s and 40s, and a smaller number of older crew. There was wear in the shoulder joints of one population, consistent with years of drawing a heavy English longbow. There was scurvy in some, and old fractures in others. There were teeth ground down by ship's biscuit and hard bread. There were arrow wounds in the bones of one man, and a perforated skull in another. The skeletons confirmed, in physical detail, what the record suggested in outline. This was a working Tudor war crew, doing the things a Tudor war crew did. What the skeletons could not, in themselves, confirm was where any of those men had come from. Bones can record a great deal about a person's working life. They cannot, on their own, record the geography of childhood. To reach that information, the team needed 2 things that were not yet routinely available in the 1980s and 1990s. They needed isotope analysis fine enough to read the chemical signature of the food and water a person had consumed during the years their teeth were forming, and they needed ancient DNA recovery techniques sensitive enough to extract usable genetic material from waterlogged Tudor bone. By the 2010s, both methods had matured. A research collaboration formed between the Mary Rose Trust, Cardiff University's Bioarchaeology Laboratory, the University of Portsmouth, and Swansea University, with Jessica Scorer of Cardiff leading the isotope work, and Sam Robson and Gary Scarlett of Portsmouth leading the genetics. The team selected 8 of the best preserved skeletons from the recovered population For full multiproxy analysis, they sampled tooth dentine and enamel for oxygen, strontium, sulfur, carbon, and nitrogen isotopes, which together can place a childhood within a few hundred miles of geological accuracy. They also extracted DNA from the cementum of the same teeth. The dense outer layer that is more resistant to environmental contamination than the inner pulp. Both nuclear DNA inherited from both parents and mitochondrial DNA, inherited only from the mother, were sequenced where the preservation allowed. The findings were published in stages in peer-reviewed journals beginning in 2020 and were translated into a public exhibition titled The Many Faces of Tudor England at the Mary Rose Museum in Portsmouth. Of the 8 men, the one the museum nicknamed Henry, after the king he served, was a teenage sailor between the ages of 14 and 18. His skull had already been flagged by archaeologists in 2015 as potentially showing African ancestry on osteological grounds alone. The new genetic analysis confirmed it. Both his nuclear DNA and his mitochondrial DNA pointed to ancestry that overlaps closely with present-day populations in Morocco, the Mozabite Berbers of Algeria, and parts of the Near East. His isotope results modified that picture in an interesting way. His oxygen and sulfur values suggested he had spent much of his early life within 50 kilometers of the British coast, in an area of Paleozoic geology, consistent with North Devon, or the southwest of England. His mitochondrial DNA, which traces only the maternal line, was compatible with British origin. His nuclear DNA, which captures both parents, pointed to a paternal line from North Africa, or the Near East. Henry was, almost certainly, the British-born son of a North African or Near Eastern father and a Devon or Cornish mother, who had grown up in the southwest of England before joining the royal fleet. He died in his teens on the king's flagship. The second man the team examined was the one historians had nicknamed the Archer Royal. He was found pinned beneath the bronze axle of one of the Mary Rose's main deck cannons, killed by the gun rolling free during the heel. He had been carrying a yew longbow of the heaviest draw class, an arrow case still containing English fletched arrows, and a leather wrist guard, an archer's brace embossed with the joined arms of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. By every conventional reading, this was a working royal archer of the kind Tudor England was famous for, the kind whose grandfathers had won Agincourt. He had been about 24 when he died. He was tall for the period, broad-shouldered,
and his upper body bore the asymmetric muscle development characteristic of a man who had drawn a heavy bow daily for years. The chemistry of his teeth told a different story. The strontium and oxygen values from his molars were not consistent with childhood in England, southern France, or any part of Britain, or its immediate neighbors. They pointed instead to a hot, dry inland environment, with a geology that closely matches parts of the southern Iberian Peninsula, or, more precisely, parts of inland North Africa. The Archer Royal had been raised somewhere south of the Mediterranean. He had then somehow made his way north into the service of an English king, learned or carried with him the skills of the heaviest English military bow, and ended his life at 24 under a fallen cannon on a Tudor warship, wearing a wrist guard bearing the arms of an English queen who herself had been born in Spain. The other 6 men told variations of the same story. 2 had isotope and DNA signatures consistent with the Western Mediterranean basin, possibly southern Iberia or southern Italy. 1 showed clear evidence of childhood in mainland Europe rather than Britain. The remaining 3 had English or coastal British origins among the 8 detailed cases. Then, only 3 were unambiguously Englishmen in the simplest geographical sense. 5 had spent at least part of their early lives outside Britain, and at least 2 of those traced to North Africa or the Mediterranean African coast. 8 men, of course, are not 400. The crew of the Mary Rose may have been disproportionately drawn from the most cosmopolitan port in southern England, and the 8 skeletons selected for testing were chosen for preservation, not representativeness. The Cardiff and Portsmouth teams have been careful to note that the proportion of men of non-English origin in the wider crew is not, on this evidence, possible to estimate precisely. What can be said with confidence, on the strength of the multi-isotope and DNA work, is that the crew of Henry VIII's flagship in 1545 included men born in North Africa, men born in the Western Mediterranean, men of mixed African and English parentage who had grown up in the West Country, and men whose entire childhood chemistry had been formed somewhere outside Britain altogether. None of them, in life, would have been read as anomalous in a Tudor port. All of them, in death, drowned in the same English king's ship. This complicates a national story. The conventional image of Henry VIII's navy is one of English sovereignty made physical, of an island nation defending itself with its own men, drawing arrows on its own bows, dying for its own crown. That image was not invented in the 20th century. It was actively cultivated by the Tudor state itself, by Elizabethan dramatists who rode into being a particular kind of stout English yeoman archer, and by every later generation that found the same image useful for its own purposes. The Mary Rose, as a wreck preserved in mud and a museum reconstructed in Portsmouth, has long been one of the central props of that image. 8 of her men, sequenced and isotoped, do not contradict the politics of the Tudor state. They contradict the demography of it. Tudor England, as historians including Miranda Kaufman and Onyeka Nubia have been arguing for over a decade, was already a port and trade society with people of African, Mediterranean, and Near Eastern origin living in its towns. There is documentary evidence of black sailors, craftsmen, musicians, and royal servants in the courts of Henry VII, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and James I. The Mary Rose data does not invent that diversity. It puts genetic and chemical detail underneath the documents. It says, in measurable terms, that the multiculturalism of Tudor England reached down into the lower decks of the king's flagship. The findings also raise a quieter question about how the Tudor naval state actually worked. None of the 8 men selected for analysis would have been carrying any obvious paperwork that recorded their place of birth. The systems of identity documentation that European states later built around national origin did not yet exist. A man of North African birth who had been baptized in a Devon parish, taken to sea as a teenager, and trained on an English heavy bow, was, in the ordinary running of Henry's fleet, simply a crew member of the Mary Rose. His skeleton, 400 years later, can be made to disclose where his teeth were formed and where his ancestors lived. His Tudor commanders almost certainly could not, and almost certainly did not. There is more material left to test. Of the 179 partial skeletons recovered from the wreck, only a fraction have been subjected to the full multi-proxy analysis that produced the 8 detailed cases. The Mary Rose Trust holds further bone, dental, cementum, and tooth enamel from dozens of additional individuals. As ancient DNA recovery and isotope ratio analysis continue to improve in resolution and cost, more of those individuals will be sequenced and read. Each new result will add a single human history to the picture and may, in time, allow a real estimate of how many of the 400 or so men aboard were actually born in England. The men who drowned on the 19th of July, 1545, were the king's sailors, soldiers, archers, gunners, and boys. They were also, in their actual lives, in a way the king's records never noted, a slice of the world of the Western European maritime trade. Some were born in coastal Devon. Some were born inside the geology of southern Iberia or North Africa. Some were the children of mixed parentage who would have been recognized in Plymouth or Portsmouth as locals despite ancestry from the southern shore of the Mediterranean. All of them ended in the same way, beneath nettings on a healing ship, in shallow water, within sight of the English king who had built her. The Mary Rose herself sits in a museum in Portsmouth now, dried and stabilized after 30 years of conservation. Lit so, the long single side of her surviving hull is visible end to end. Beside her, in a separate gallery, Henry of Devon and the Archer Royal of inland North Africa stand reconstructed in artist's wax, in the clothes Tudor sailors wore on the deck of an English warship. They do not look like the school textbook crew of Henry VIII's Navy. They look like what the bones and teeth and DNA say they were. They look like the men who actually died on the Mary Rose.